very much, Cathaoirleach. We won't be opposing this bill. There are a number of favourable measures contained therein. The Minister outlined them all there in some detail, so I don't see the need to rehearse them. I would say, however, that I do note, however, that the increase in the provision for social protection, the social protection budget this year, is about 1.5%. That has to be measured against economic growth of over 5%, insofar as I understand the figure to be. The point I want to make, the few points I want to make in the time allotted to me is that with some administrative adjustments and with some legislative changes and a small increase in expenditure, the 20 billion, we could get much more value for each one of the 20 billion plus euro that we're spending on social protection. And I'll try in the time available to me to illustrate that. I deeply regret that the old narrative about social welfare was recently resurrected in the course of the presidential election campaign by people who, sought to get cheap votes, track popularity, by saying that the source of all our ills in this country was the amount of money we're spending on social protection. The depths of ignorance from which those people were talking is surely reflected by the fact that they don't seem to realise that job seekers' benefit, job seekers' allowance now accounts for less than 10% of social welfare expenditure. The main social welfare expenditure is payments to people who are too disabled or too sick to work, payments to people who are single parents, who because of the lack of childcare facilities in this country can't go out to work, payments to pensioners who are too old to work, whose working life has expired. And we can't forget that the child benefit payment in excess of 2 billion comes from the social welfare budget. I mean, anybody who suggests that, that by reducing those payments, for example, the disability allowance for a single person, at the moment it's 198.50. It's going up by €5 sometime in March. Reducing that, reducing the carers allowance, which is €214 per week, going up by a fiver. Indeed, reducing pensions with all the extra expenses that the elderly have. That by reducing those payments, or even eliminating them in some cases, that we'd suddenly have nirvana in this country, that all our economic and social problems would suddenly end if we only reduced the fairly meagre payments to these people. That I find disgusting. And I'm certainly, I said it at the time and I say it again, I don't know about you, Les Cathaoirleach, but I certainly wouldn't want to belong to a political party which was, which included a member voicing such sentiments. Now, yesterday we didn't get a chance to finish our discussion on a question I put down about young job seekers. But, we have to be very careful as politicians that we don't sort of say things or do things that feed into that false narrative that I've just referred to. I mean, the Taoiseach played his part in raising the narrative again when he went after so-called fraudulent claims. I mean, the reality is, and we all know it, that the vast majority of payments recovered by the Department of Social Protection each year is due to overpayments. In the vast majority of cases, those overpayments are not the fault of the person who is ultimately forced to pay back the money. And the figure for fraud is really minuscule. It should be pursued, of course, and people who deliberately defraud the system should be subjected to the full rigours of the law. But it feeds into a certain narrative which is false. And I regret to say that just at the evening, on question time, the Minister across the floor from me seemed to sort of feed into that narrative again. I asked her what the present rationale was for the distinction in payments between people over the age of 26, as far as job seekers' allowance is concerned, and people under the age of 26. Now, that distinction was first brought in, admittedly, in 2010, in a very small way, but it was magnified enormously since. And the ministers, we opened the door, yes, and the door was open a long time in Northern Ireland too, in the UK. But anyway, the fact of the matter is that I asked for the rationale, and the Minister more or less told me that her rationale was that all the people in this country aged 18 to 26 are sort of people who would prefer to sit at home watching Judge Judy than go out and get a job or take on training, etc. Now that feeds into the narrative, you know, and I really think that the Minister should withdraw that remark. But as I'm on the subject of job seekers and job seekers allowance and job seekers benefit, can I ask the Minister to indicate in her response, you know, what is the future for Torres Nua? My understanding is that contract is due to expire, is it next year or 2020? Can she give us an assurance that that's the end we'll see of Torres Nua? Because whatever objective Torres Nua was paid, and very well paid, may I say, to achieve, you know, it's no longer relevant. As a matter of fact, the people coming to me now illustrate to me very clearly that Torres Nua is now more of a hindrance than a help to people who are trying to join the workforce. In relation to the self-employed, can I ask the Minister how many people have qualified for invalidity pension? How many self-employed people have qualified for invalidity pension? And what is the situation in regards to self-employed people who become ill or disabled or incapacitated for a short period of time? Are there any plans to extend the illness benefit provision to the self-employed? Because to qualify for invalidity pension, you must prove that you are permanently, more or less permanently, incapable of work. Not everybody who becomes temporarily disabled can prove that they're, because they won't be, permanently incapable of work. And while I welcome the announcement by the Minister that job seekers benefit for the self-employed would be brought in from the last quarter of next year by whoever happens to be Minister for Social Protection at the time, that can I just raise one thing? The amount of PRSI being paid by the self-employed is less than half that being paid by workers, and yet it's proposed to give them exactly the same benefits. Now, I'm aware of a number of surveys amongst the self-employed, and I think something like 85% or something were really enthusiastic about making a contribution towards this themselves, rather than letting it be borne by the taxpayer at large. In relation to carers, there's now 1 in 20 people in Ireland caring for a family member. Collectively, they're providing about 10 billion in unpaid care work to the state. And, you know, we have to come to grips with this, and we have to start planning for this, because all the studies show that by 2030, which isn't very far away, demographic changes will require that 1 in 5 people, 1 in 5 in this country will have to take on a carer's role, which is 4 times that amount. Carers allowance stroke benefit is paid to 73,000 carers. That means that 75% of those people who are providing caring duties don't get any payment at all. The amount itself they're paid, while it's more generous than job seekers allowance, job seekers benefit, there's only €16 per week in the difference. Now, I think the eligibility criteria for carers allowance are too strict. I've had 1 or 2 people come to me only in the last few weeks to say that while they've got carers allowance, they're caring for a family member who happens to be a child in each case. They're both self-employed on a part-time basis, and they have to turn away work, a few hours extra work, which they can't take, thereby depriving themselves of the ability to earn a decent income besides their carers allowance to help lift their family out of poverty. I'm not saying, I do realise why there must be a limit on the time that carers can work outside the home. Obviously, if they're working outside the home all the time, they can't be providing caring facilities. But I think there should be a bit of flexibility here. I came across another case recently where somebody who was working outside the home, working irregular hours, maybe up to 17, 18 hours some weeks, 10, 12 hours other weeks. On average, it came to about less than 15 hours per week. And yet they were deprived, they were told they weren't entitled to carers allowance because some weeks they were working more than the 15 hours. Now, I think that indicates a huge rigidity in the system, which should be looked at. A lot of people have complained to me that if caring ends while the carer is still of working age, there are a number of barriers to returning to work, which often results in carers being locked out of the labour market. There's an excellent organisation called Family Carers Ireland. They, I'm sure my colleagues and everybody else, read their very useful suggestions which they put forward for changes to the system, which would cost very little, very, very little in the overall scheme of things, but there's no sign of them being implemented. For example, they suggested that a carer's allowance should be disregarded in the calculation of differential rent, medical costs for carers, reduction in prescription charges, and reintroduction of the transport support scheme, which I'll come back to presently. Improvement to the senior alert scheme. Again, flexibility in the conditions, and simple things that wouldn't cost anything extra, like the early alert system for entitlement to OIP when a carer is 3 months short of 66, as applies in other people in receipt of other social welfare payments, and a review of the rules, of course, generally, as I said, to provide more flexibility. That association put forward another initiative, which I think the government should look very carefully at. There are a number of services relating to carers which are funded but not uniformly or not evenly across the country. The amount of assistance you get under the different schemes will depend on where in the country you happen to live. It's the postcode lottery. Now, the proposal from the organisation in question shows clearly there was some rebalancing of existing local budgets and an overall increase of about €3 million per annum, which isn't a fortune. Services like respite, individual support, training of carers, information and advocacy, etc., could be guaranteed in a fairly uniform way throughout the country. And surely, you know, the people throughout the country, regardless of where they're living, are entitled to the same services as everybody else. In relation to disabilities, this is one of the areas where poverty seems to be increasing rather than decreasing, despite the economic growth we've enjoyed in recent times. More than 1 in 3, that's 39.1%, almost 1 in 2 in fact, of people unable to work due to disability live below the poverty line. Now, in its pre-budget submission, Inclusion Ireland highlighted the lack of workplace supports for people with disabilities. You know, it's not enough to try to identify a job for a person with a disability. In many, many cases, you have to support them as well in the workplace, at least in the initial stages. The National Disability Inclusion Strategy includes a target to increase public sector employment for people with disabilities from 3% to 6% by 2024. At the rate of increase we are getting at the moment, according to figures produced by the National Disability Authority, it will be 2041 before this 2024 target is met. And I would again urge the Minister, as I've urged the Taoiseach on many occasions, to please let us have the motorised transport and the mobility allowance back. This was stopped, frozen in 2013. Thousands and thousands of people have qualified for it since, and yet every time I ask the question, or anybody else asks the question about when it's being restored, we're taught it's very complex, it's very detailed, there's legislation, there's this person looking at that and some other person looking at something else. For heaven's sake, you know, it's been over 5 years now. Advocacy for families with disability is virtually non-existent. So the personal advocacy services as provided under the Citizens Information Act of 2007 should be commenced immediately. And I would also ask the Minister to comment on why disability allowance cases, why 73% of appeals, there's an almost knee-jerk reaction to refuse disability allowance if it's applied for. And don't give me the old story about holding back documentation for the appeal. I mean, in my experience, that's not widespread practice amongst people applying for disability allowance. They give you all the documentation, anything to support that claim. But yet, in 73% of cases, appeals are partially or wholly successful. Now, you know, if you had a judge at whatever level and up to 3 out of every 4 decisions he was making was being reversed, you'd surely conclude there was something fundamentally wrong. In relation to single parents, I welcome the increase in the disregard. Obviously, though it's far short of what was sought. Now, as you will be aware, Minister, the Committee on Social Protection did a lot of work, undertook a lot of research on how to improve conditions for lone parents, which were very adversely affected by Joan Burton's changes back in 2012. And, you know, the reaction of the action, rather, resulting from the department to that report is most disappointing. There are several very good suggestions in there that would cost relatively little, peanuts in many cases, and would substantially improve the position of single parents. And why the department doesn't take them on board, I can't understand. We discussed yesterday the idea of a maintenance recovery unit. Can the Minister comment on the fact that if somebody goes to court at the moment for maintenance and the recalcitrant partner, the defendant, decides not to pay, there are some social welfare officers at least that insist on assessing the maintenance against the individual, even though they're not getting paid any money. Surely this discourages people from pursuing maintenance. I mean, they're opening themselves to a terrible risk. I mean, if they get the order and the money isn't paid, the social welfare person will say to them, the social welfare officer will say, well, according to the information available to us, you have maintenance of X euro per week, and therefore we're assessing that against you. That is a practice, Minister. Make no mistake about it, that is a practice. In relation to pathways back to work for lone parents, the situation is still very unclear. There's a lack of coordination between the different departments. For example, financial support only appears to be available for full-time courses, which doesn't facilitate the caring responsibility of single parents. In relation to pensions, I note section 9 of the bill, and we'll return to this in more detail at committee stage. I would say to the Minister, I realise the 40-year baseline is only for the calculation of what's due to the post-2012 pensioners. But when you're establishing the new system that's going to replace the present system, the total contribution system, we will be urging you very, very strongly to use a baseline of 30 years. We will also be urging you very strongly to reduce that huge hurdle of 520 paid contributions to qualify at all back to 260 contributions. And I also note from my brief perusal of section 9 that if somebody is claiming home care credits and separate credits for, say, periods for which they were unemployed or on disability or whatever, there is a cap. The cap on home care credits is 1,040, and you can have up to 530 non-home care credits. But if you have both, the cap, you're still restricted to 1,040, which I think is extremely restrictive. There are a number of other issues. For example, a colleague of mine recently brought to my attention an anomaly in the provisions relating to domiciliary care allowance. It would appear that, or it actually has happened in a case in which he was involved with, where there was joint custody granted, and each of the two parents was spending about equal time each week with the child. They've both been refused domiciliary care allowance on the basis that the relevant legislation states that you must spend at least 5 nights per week with the child. Now, I feel that the child in this particular case, and I'll send you on the details, is being discriminated against. I'm disappointed, incidentally, that there are no changes in the regulations and conditions surrounding working family dividend rather. This was the replacement for FIS, and we were told it was some sort of a magical panacea that was going to encourage work, etc., and was going to combat poverty and reduce inequality, etc. It's the old FIS. It's just been renamed. Well, very, very minor, very minor, very minor. Practically, I rephrase that. Practically no change. So, I mean, those are some of the issues that we'll be raising at committee stage. We will. I mean, as I say, we won't be opposing the legislation at committee stage. I've no intention of opposing increases for people on disabilities and job seekers, etc. The one point I would make is that these changes only kick in, of course, from the end of March, whereas the tax changes, they kick in from the 1st of January. And I think that's fundamentally inequitable. It means, that when you say in the last paragraph of your speech, Minister, that you're giving a €5 a week increase, you're not actually. You're giving about $3.75 per week, because it doesn't kick in until the end of March. So, they're the main items anyway, and we will be looking more carefully, as I say, at section 9 and a number of other sections, and we will be putting forward amendments at committee stage insofar as we can. Of course, we're still constrained by that crazy rule that we can't put in anything that's going to cost the exchequer an extra penny. That's going to be ruled out of order. But within that constraint, we will, while we won't be opposing the bill at second stage, we'll do our very best to make it even better at committee stage.